generals instead of diplomats. Donald Trump, after the latest round of talks in Abu Dhabi on Russia's war against Ukraine and in Oman on Iran's nuclear program, decided to completely change the rules of negotiations with Russia and Iran. And by the way, this change could benefit Ukraine. In particular, the United States president, for the first time, involved the main commander of American forces in the Middle East in negotiations with Iran, and made the United States Secretary of the Army the key negotiator for ending Russia's war against Ukraine. Moreover, it is known that Alexis Grinkevich, the commander of United States forces in Europe, was also present at the last round of negotiations in Abu Dhabi. The Ukrainian delegation is now led by former Chief Intelligence Officer Kirilo Budanov, while the Russian side is headed by Intelligence Officer Kostyukov. Experts are now confident this will greatly change negotiation dynamics, since earlier Vladimir Putin managed to convince Donald Trump and his advisor Stephen Witkoff that Russia's victory was supposedly just around the corner. That very soon Donbass would be completely captured by the occupiers, that Ukraine was doomed to lose, and so on. And unfortunately for us, Trump believed it. For example, he and his vice president said Ukraine should give up Donbass, since they believed Russia would take it anyway. To them, this was already assumed. Now it's much harder to convince the military of something that isn't actually happening on the battlefield. For example, the military can clearly see that Kupiansk remains uncaptured by the Russians. In this episode, we'll discuss the latest news about the negotiations and how Donald Trump's new Donbas tactics will affect the positions of Ukraine and Russia. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave any comment, and subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News. The link is in this video's description. So, as many may have already noticed, Donald Trump has changed his approach to negotiations with Russia and Iran. For the first time, the United States president involved the main commander of American forces in the Middle East in negotiations with Iran, and made the United States Secretary of the Army a key negotiator. After Russia's war against Ukraine, the military, not diplomats, have become the negotiators. Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of United States Central Command, which is responsible for all operations in the Middle East, for the first time joined the United States Iranian negotiations yesterday. He appeared at the meeting in full dress uniform as a reminder of the increasing American military presence in the region. Well, after the negotiations, he went together with Witkoff and Kushner to the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, which is currently stationed in the Arabian Sea. At the same time, United States Secretary of the Army Dan Driscal continues to play his role in the negotiations on the Russian-Ukrainian war. This week, as is known, Driscal tried to maintain a dialogue with Ukrainian officials during breaks between sessions. During direct meetings between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations, the Americans did not interfere. However, between sessions, Driscal appeared to consult with the Ukrainians. In addition, Alexis Grinkevich was also present at the negotiations. He is the commander of United States forces in Europe, who may eventually take command of Western forces that could be deployed in Ukraine to monitor prey. In turn, Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and Special Envoy Stephen Witkoff are balancing between both complex negotiation processes. And previously it was on these two, Kushner and Witkoff, that Trump placed his main bet, believing that everything can be negotiated if you speak the language of business and trade. Both are businessmen, and Trump quickly showed his approach to classical diplomacy. The decision to involve military leaders, either because of their expertise in communications or to signal potentially tough courses of action. It demonstrates how exactly the Republican administration turned traditional American foreign policy and diplomacy upside down. And, as you know, after the latest talks in Abu Dhabi, American and Russian military officials even resumed communication channels that had been cut off in 2021, right before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in this regard, it's important to understand that Trump, especially after the situation with Venezuela, decided that flexing muscles is much more effective than conducting traditional diplomacy. although some experts are convinced otherwise. They say that appointing active military leaders to diplomatic positions shows how the Trump administration has devalued qualified diplomats and the tools of diplomacy as such, in favor of relying too much on the military when trying to solve certain foreign policy challenges, as if, well, the military is supposedly given too much honor. There are also traditional diplomats, and supporters of classical diplomacy say, well, yes. Negotiations are complex. They require many rounds of talks, forming technical groups, and more. This could last indefinitely. Personally, I tend to reach a different conclusion. I would remind you that American generals, that is the military, not diplomats, participated in arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and it produced results. But there's another aspect here as well. United States Secretary of the Army Driscal now serves as liaison between Ukraine and the United States. Previously, Kit Kellogg held this position. In November 2025, Driscal was suddenly appointed for negotiations. The negotiations had reached a deadlock at that time, and Dan Driscal used his already planned trip to Ukraine as an opportunity to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky and other top government, military, and defense industry officials. Since then, Driscal has participated in several other negotiation sessions, including a meeting in Abu Dhabi. This week, Driscal's role has taken shape around serving as a kind of liaison, together with Driscal. Kirill Budanov-Tver, and again follow the chronology. It was right after the Trump administration decided to shift the diplomatic vector toward involving the military. It was right after that Kirill Budanov was appointed head of the president's office and, more importantly, head of the Ukrainian negotiation group, and then this happens. This press writes that the current relationship between the Trump administration and the Ukrainians is the result of Driscal's ability to maintain dialogue between negotiation sessions, as well as his military perspective as a leader and former army officer. But what else is important here? In Abu Dhabi, at those very negotiations on February 4th to 5th, Dan Driscal was joined by United States General Alexus Grinkevich, the commander of American and NATO forces in Europe, who helped conduct negotiations to restore the level of high-level military dialogue between the United States and Russia. As a result, it is now the military, not the diplomats, of the three countries, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, who are in constant contact. So, from what we understand, the negotiation process has taken a completely new direction. And how can we not recall, for example, the assessment by Politico, which wrote that these peace talks are different from all previous ones because the Ukrainian side and, importantly, the Russian side have become more constructive. Well, and the Russians have stopped giving their pseudo-historical lectures. But that's not all. For Ukraine, involving the military in the negotiations is only to our advantage, it only benefits us. Here, of course, it can be noted that this means we are very close to a technical decision on a ceasefire, which is why professional military personnel have been involved. But I'll talk a little about something else. In the presentation of the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, Russia's victory in this war is already so close that it seems you can almost touch it. And Putin has been feeding this logic into the ears of Stephen Witkoff and Donald Trump for months. As you recall, Vladimir Putin and his officials have often claimed that Russia holds this strategic initiative on the Ukrainian front. You all remember how Putin personally announced the capture of Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, and recently they already captured Kupiansk, Uzlovaya. Then it turns out that all of this is total lies. Putin says Donbass is close to being captured, repeating similar claims. But the whole problem is that this entire story is picked up by the American leadership as well. Vice President J. Divens predicts that Russia will capture all of Donbass one way or another. Donald Trump, commenting on footage of the Moscow military parade, supposedly told his aides that Putin's army looks invincible, and he even wanted to hold his own military parade. As a result, the United States is linking security guarantees for Ukraine to territorial concessions. You're going to lose Donbass anyway, so just give up. And it's no surprise that Trump might genuinely believe that Putin has already captured Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, Uzlovoy, and a bunch of other cities. I mean, Trump doesn't really look at the map much. Remember how Zelensky brought him a map to show him, look, here's Pokrovsk and here's Kupiansk? Well, that's just total nonsense. And Trump might genuinely not understand why these Ukrainians are so stubborn and don't want to give up this little patch of Donbass. Well, come on, there isn't that much territory left there anyway. But the military, like Driscal and Grinkevich, they understand better what it means to surrender strategic heights and fortified positions in Donbass to the enemy. And the military definitely see that Kupiansk hasn't been captured by the Russians, and the Russian army itself also has problems, and it's not invincible at all. And in such a sober state, conducting negotiations is much more productive and, importantly, more beneficial for Ukraine. I'll leave it at that. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, hit the bell, and like this episode. If you found this episode useful and interesting, you can support our work with your donation or a paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. I would appreciate any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.